Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope this video finds you well wherever you are in the world. If you don't mind, I would very much like to share with you some thoughts that I have with respect to a very recent release made by the Criterion collection during this month of the year 2020. February 2020 to be exact. The film was released under spy number 1012. The film is from 1999 and the filmmaker is Pedro Almodvar. The film is all about my mother. As I mentioned, this film is from 1999, and this has a very wide-reaching and wide range of emotional scope that is at the heart of this film, which I think gives it a really great appeal and a wide-ranging appeal that is very much universal in tone, as well as focusing in on the intricacies of the particular cultures that are represented in this film with such vivid imagery and great color and wonderful affection and true sincerity from all the participants, cast and crew concerned. This is at once a sort of comic portrait of life. It is also a dramatic portrait of life. It is also a tragic portrait of life. And all of this is within the same mix concerning a group of people that have feelings, that have emotions, that are on the surface as well as beyond the surface. This is a powerful work in terms of the presentation of the characters and the stories that consume them, to the point of being all-consuming and far-reaching, with oftentimes quite deep and quite significant consequences for everyone concerned. The subject matter, I think, is dealing at its heart with the sense of relationships, this idea of relationships between parents and children, and the idea of what we tell our children in terms of the creation of a fabric of a reality that is ongoing throughout childhood and then through adulthood. But then that leads so nicely into certain themes that filmmakers, Almodvar himself cites in some of the special features, which I'll get to in a second, which go to, in broad terms, ideas about reality versus fiction, and what's on the surface versus what's beneath the surface, and how, on the one hand, all of these things can lead to an idea of what perhaps might be termed to be artifice, but I don't want to use the term artifice to suggest something that is fake. Rather, there is an artifice which could suggest a surface level, but in fact, there is also something that is pure and honest and true underneath. But the interesting, almost paradoxical thing about the way Almodvar treats his characters in his world with such affection and such respect and such grace is that even what's on the surface, what might be deemed to be artifice or fiction, is still in many ways tied to some kind of truth about that particular character. In other words, the characters that Almodvar presents in this world of All About My Mother in the context of the narrative that he basically constructs, the environment that he constructs, which is I think supposed to mirror a sense of this idea of freedom and liberation on the one hand, but also the real life hardships and almost tragic consequences that can lead from that notion of liberation and freedom in a very striking, upfront way. In this portrait of Barcelona, which makes up the majority of the film. But this idea of fiction and reality, of artifice and of let's say, non-artifice, if you will. I think it's all tied together. In other words, what's on the surface is still linked to something that is true to the character, just as much as that person's heart or soul is linked to what is true about the character. In other words, fiction and reality both yield some kind of truth about a particular character that's being presented. And I find that dynamic to be really fascinating. In other words, what is seen on the surface is just as true for a character as what is revealed about that character underneath the surface as the film progresses. And it's this idea of the possibility of a duality, which we see with many of the characters from the outset. We see that many of them seem to have an outer surface and an inner surface, but as time progresses and as the film moves towards its resolutions, we actually realize that these characters are just as true on the outside as they are on the inside. And when that realization is made, that leads to a kind of almost a realization that what we are seeing is a really tender portrait, an emotionally rich portrait of characters here that are drawn so vividly and with such care and with such beauty and grace that one walks away from viewing this film all about my mother feeling at once very sad, perhaps, but also filled with a lot of hope and also filled with a lot of encouragement and happiness. It's not a purely anodyne sense of happiness, as I indicated. It is tinged with elements of sadness and tragedy. But this is meant to be evoking a rich tapestry of human drama. And I think with the comedy elements here, with the tragic elements here, with the vivid, almost cinematic, poetic elements here, as well as the attempts at getting at something quite raw and real, and at times both vicious and also very tender and earnest. What we are getting with this film all about my mother is a complex tapestry, if you will, of something that is meant to be a sort of nuanced portrait that is still filled with an emotional truth at its core that leaves one quite moved and stunned when the film reaches its conclusion and reaches the end credits roll in a very beautiful and unforgettable way. This is the really remarkable work called All About My Mother from the Criterion Collection. And this presentation by the Criterion Collection is a really lovely presentation. It's a new 2K digital presentation. And so this is supervised by the director Pedro Almodvar and also by the producer Agustin Almodvar with 5.1 surround DTS HD master audio soundtrack. So this is really a lovely presentation. The colors are quite bold and they pop out in a lovely way. And if you know this film, you know that its use of color is quite striking, and it's very almost pop art sort of use of color and almost very theatrical. in its use of color, but I think that's part of the point, and it gets at the heart of Almodóvar's insistence on treating the theme of reality versus fiction in this very emotionally truthful way that he does in All About My Mother. And so the visual presentation with this digital restoration, I think, serves that element to a very positive effect, and very, very effectively. So it's a great presentation of this film. And then if we go to the supplements of this. This is a very interesting element of the Criterion Collection release here. So we have 3 supplements that are included in the supplement section of the disc here. The supplements themselves, I should point out, they don't seem to be Criterion Collection produced supplements. In other words, they seem to be taken from other sources that are non-Criterion. And perhaps at first glance, that might seem to be a bit underwhelming as far as a Criterion Collection release is concerned. After all, we expect, or we have come to expect from Criterion, that at least with most of the Criterion releases, Criterion will usually provide maybe one or more of its own produced supplements, maybe an interview with a critic or an academic, or maybe a new audio commentary or something like that. But here we don't get any new Criterion supplement or new Criterion produced supplement. So at first glance, that might seem to be a little bit underwhelming as far as a release is concerned. But I would actually suggest something quite opposite, and I'll let you know as I describe the supplements here. So the first supplement is a 52-minute documentary from 2012, and this is a documentary that features many of the participants in the film, and including Pedro Almodvar himself, as well as many of the cast and some of the crew in interview style. And it's really a nice overview of specific aspects of the filmmaking and specific production details and background information about the making of the film, as well as Almodóvar's philosophy as a filmmaker, and also going into a very brief overview into his filmography and background and his work up to and even beyond All About My Mother, and also talking about his filmmaking and how his filmmaking emerged against the backdrop of Spanish history as it was changing and evolving from the 70s and then into the 80s. And this is actually quite significant, which this documentary goes into and points out, I think, quite effectively, which is this idea of the Spain and Franco, and then the death of Franco, and then the introduction into a new phase of Spanish history into the late 70s and then in early 80s. This idea of a new spirit of liberation and freedom, which also is coinciding with the emergence of Almodóvar's filmmaking career, starting with very low-budget projects, but then gradually making his way through the early to mid-'80s and then into the late 80s and then through the 90s up to the end of the 90s with All About My Mother. And so the documentary is actually very, very helpful for one to get a sense of his history and the like. And I would also say that the documentary is also quite great in that it talks also about the specifics of the film itself, and also about the kinds of concerns that the cast had. Concerns, when I say concerns, I mean the kinds of things that were on the cast and crew's mind as they were making certain scenes of the film. For example, Penelope Cruz is seen being interviewed. She, as you know, plays Rosa, Sister Rosa, which is a very key role in the film. And she talks anecdotally about how the scene involves a certain moment when, early on in the film, when the main character, who is Manuela, played by Cecilia Roth, she returns from Madrid to Barcelona. And in fact, she goes to a very interesting place where these women are gathering. And Penelope Cruz actually speaks about this group of women and how they were revealing many of their real life experiences, because apparently some of these women who were shown on the film and their role in the film apparently were like sex workers. And so Penelope Cruz recounts how they were actually had histories as sex workers, and they were telling their stories to her and to the other actors on the set, and how that was a very emotional and very real and very sort of impactful moment, and it really showed her, Penelope Cruz, just how much this film, All About My Mother, which is essentially a story that is dealing with this slice of society, if you will, in a very honest and, I think, very endearing way. Just how this film is really trying to, at its heart, get at a real truth and a real earnestness in trying to convey that truth with respect to these characters. And so this, I think, was a very important anecdote, and it's an example of how I think great this particular documentary is. Again, it's not a Criterion-produced documentary, mind you, but it's still very, very helpful in that it's well-balanced, and it also goes into Almodvar's career, but also goes into specifics of this film and its themes and its ambitions, and also its philosophy as far as how it's trying to portray certain kinds of universal truths about these particular characters and where they are in this particular strata of society, if you will, and how they are trying to cope with certain tragedies and hardships that come with that. But even despite those tragedies and hardships, they still have a way of smiling and connecting with each other and bonding with each other in a very true and pure way. So I think these sorts of themes get at the heart of this film, and I think the documentary gets at that very, very clearly, and also with a lot of nice anecdotes along the way. So it's a documentary that I think is well worth watching. And then there is another documentary that's a second supplement on this disc. And this is from 1999, and according to the description, it's from Spanish television. And so this is a documentary that is essentially focusing in on Pedro Almodvar's mother. And this is a very poignant documentary, in fact. And it's not so long. It's maybe about less than an hour. And it's essentially showing video footage of interviews with Almodvar and his mother together. Also clips of scenes with his mother, and also Sunday dinners and things like that, them walking together, the countryside of La Mancha, and also hearing stories from his mother, or stories from the filmmaker about his mother, and how this particular aspect of his life, his relationship with his mother, has a kind of a deep fundamental connection with this particular film. It's not a film that I would say feels autobiographical in that sense. It's not, for instance, it's not a film about a filmmaker who has a relationship with his mother. And I'm not trying to suggest that at all. And for those of you who've seen the film, you know what I'm talking about. It's not directly pertinent to the actual plot of the film per se, but those of you who know the film will also know that the theme of parents and children, in particular mothers and children, is a very potent theme. And also the idea of motherhood and motherliness and being motherly, and how this idea of being motherly extends beyond the mother-child relationship, and it goes towards all the relationships, in essence, that are depicted with intimacy in this film. There's a sort of motherly aspect, in particular to the main character, Manuela, the Cecilia Roth character. There's a certain motherly aspect to her and how she relates to the various characters in the films that she encounters that I find so beautiful and very warm. And I think this warmth and this sort of generosity that is inherent with the notion of motherliness, I think is is the reason why, or one of the main reasons why I think the autobiographical element with respect to Pedro Almodvar and his mother is so significant and relevant to a reading of this film. And so that's why I think this inclusion of the documentary that focuses in on Almodóvar's mother is really quite lovely. I should also say that it's also very poignant because for those of you who know the release history of this film, so this was released in 1999, and according to the materials here in the Criterion booklet and also in the other supplements, his mother unfortunately passed away not long after the release of this film. And so to know that and to watch the supplement about his mother is actually quite emotionally affecting, and it's very moving. It's incredibly moving to see his interactions with his mother. There's one particular moment that is really quite striking, and it's a moment also that is also recollected in one of the written parts of the booklet, which I'll get to in a second. And it's a moment where the mother, Pedro Almodóvar, and his mother are seen together, sitting together side by side, and they're recounting this idea of when many, many years ago when he was younger, and the family was poor. They needed some extra income, and in order to do that, the mother decided to take on this role of reading letters to neighbors in this particular neighborhood, and the neighbors were not literate, they were illiterate, and so they couldn't read on their own, which meant that his mother took it upon herself in order to get a little bit of extra money to read letters to their neighbors, and in order to tell them what the contents of letters from I don't know, relatives, distant relatives, etc. were. And so this is a really interesting episode because Pedro Almodóvar also recounts this memory, and he says how there would be occasions where the mother would be reading a letter, and the letter that she would be reading and what she was actually saying sometimes didn't match. And so what that meant was that she was, in essence, making up certain parts of her letter reading. In other words, she was saying stuff that wasn't necessarily written in the letter. And Pedro Almodóvar noticed this. And so after they left a house one day, he asked her, why did you do this? And she said, it's, and I'm paraphrasing, but she said, this is something that she felt they wanted to hear. And it was like she was trying to make them feel better about them hearing something that she felt they would be happier hearing rather than what was actually written down in the letter. And this is such a striking story for a number of reasons, I think. First, it just shows a sense of creativeness, an inherent creativeness and intelligence that his mother has. I mean, you see her in the documentary, and she's elderly, but she still has an obvious sharpness of wit and intelligence. And also this particular story that the two of them recount also is very suggestive of a high degree of creativity. And so it's no wonder that she is the mother of Pedro Almodvar, one of the most creative voices in cinema today. I mean, she is such she's so creative with this particular story, and it's just suggestive of just how creative she must have been throughout her entire life. A really lovely story, I think. But also, it's so interesting because this gets to the heart also of what Pedro Almodvar speaks to in some of the other supplements when he's interviewed. That is the role of fiction and reality. And in the film All About My Mother, I think, again, to speak as vaguely as possible, this theme of fiction versus reality is played in a very earnest and sincere way. It's not to say that fiction is treated as fake and reality is treated as truth. It's much more complicated than that. Fiction has also a soothing, almost therapeutic element to it that is also linked to truth, just as closely as reality is linked to truth. In other words, fiction is still a very valid expression of a kind of truth in these characters. And I think the story about his mother reading the letters in this way is also very emblematic of that. It's almost like she's using fiction in a way to make the lives of her neighbors a little bit better. And that is getting at, in a very interesting way, a kind of truth about her intuitive understanding of her neighbors and the human connections that she obviously was able to make and was able to sense based on her own intuition. And that also undoubtedly gets at a sense of truth about her and about the people around her. So it's like the story. She uses fiction in a way to get at the truth of this community, which is mirroring perfectly what I think this film is about, or one of the main themes of this film, All About My Mother. So it's such a beautiful, symbolic story, and it's so touching and it's so personal. It's perfect, and that's one of the reasons why that documentary is really, really great. And then finally, to round out the supplements, there is a supplement from very recently, I want to say, let's see here, it's 2019, yes. And it's a Q&A screening. It's actually divided into two parts: before the screening, a sort of introductory talk, and then after the screening. And the participants from the cast and crew include Agustin Almodvar and Pedro Almodvar, and also Marisa Paredes, who plays Uma Rojo, who's a very, very significant role. I mean, talk about fiction versus reality and theater and reality. I mean, she is the actress in the film, or she's a film in the film. She portrays an actress who is in a play within the film that is also very significant to the plot of the film, and events that relate to her early on really lead to the development and progress of the narrative as it goes towards its beginning, middle, and end. So very significant. And the performance is remarkable and so tender and so charming. And so it's wonderful to hear these participants speak about the film, even though it's many years after the fact. It was, according to the back here, it's 2019. So this is, 20 years after the first release of the film. And it's still wonderful to hear them talk with great detail and great love and great affection and real honesty about the film, even 20 years after the fact. It still has such a great impact even now. And so I'm really glad that this is here. It really gives a nice, fresh perspective on it, and it shows just how well this film is being treated by time. I saw this film very recently, given that this was released by the Criterion Collection very, very recently, and I was amazed at how well this film held up, and how it still maintains a real timeless feeling of energy and urgency, but at the same time it takes its time to let the characters breathe and grow, and also laugh, and also let us laugh, and give us time to feel warm and get to know them as the events then unfold to their specific conclusions, of course. But this has aged remarkably well, and I'm so happy of that, because it's a real lovely and tough and challenging work that is just a testament to how powerful Almodvar is as a filmmaker and an artist. But to see this perspective displayed in this Q&A from 2019 is really refreshing, and it's a great reinforcement of that. So that is the third of the three supplements in the supplement section of this release here. So in terms of the number of supplements, again, it's only 3, but they are very full of a lot of information and a lot of great moments. And so in terms of the contents of the supplements themselves, I would say there is no lacking in quality. On the contrary, it is very much filled with a lot of quality and a lot of relevance. And for anyone who wants to get a good grounding into learning more about this film, it's a great place to go, especially the documentary, and get a nice grasp as to what specific background production history details were, and also Almodóvar and his filmmaking style and his development as a filmmaker and the like. So this is, on the one hand, they are non-Criterion produced, but on the other hand, they are filled with a lot of great content. So I should point out that there is, of course, unfortunately, a lack of an audio commentary, which is a shame, because it's always nice to have a commentary. It would have been really great to have a commentary here, but alas, we don't get one. I would suggest, however, that the information that one can find in the documentaries and also in the booklet, which I'll touch on in a second, I think serve as a nice way to get information that one could have also gotten from a commentary. In other words, the lack of a commentary track does not make this film, as released by the Criterion Collection, bereft of anything, because we still get plenty of information covered via the booklet and then by the supplements included in the disc itself. So there is that. Speaking of the booklet, I should point out that the booklet is this, and just in terms of a sort of my own personal take, it's a booklet which is stapled, which is lovely, and there are a lot of pages here. It's a 32-page booklet, not including the back cover here. So very thick, very full, and I love it. I'm a big fan of the stapled booklet, and so I'm glad to see this back, and Criterion hasn't completely abandoned it, so it's really wonderful. And it's filled with three writings. So the first is an essay written by Emma Wilson called Matriarchal Society. Matriarchal Society. This is another great sort of overview of Almodóvar's career, and also how All About My Mother seems to figure into this career in terms of broad themes, general themes that seem to be touched upon in many of his major works, and how that is relevant to All About My Mother, and relationships, and in particular relationships between women or among women as being a key component of this film. And when I say women, I should say that this film, if you know this film, tends to look at the idea of gender and sexuality in a way that is maybe, for some people, it might not necessarily be what one is used to. Let me put it that way. But there is still a tenderness and a truth and honesty in this depiction. And it can be described as maybe motherly, as I described it before, warm, pure, and filled with a lot of humanism. And the essay by Emma Wilson, I think, gets at that very well, and it describes it quite nicely, and much better ways, in much better terms than I could ever hope to do so. So it's strongly recommended on that front alone, not to mention, of course, the fact that it also includes a lot of great information about Almodóvar's career, and also about the context of his growing career and how this film fits into that very well. And then the second writing in the booklet is called "A Group of Women Talking is the Origin of All Stories," an interview with Pedro Almodóvar, conducted in April 1999, conducted by Frederick Strauss. And so this is an interview that is being conducted around the time of the release of the film in 1999. And what I love about this is another way of us to get at the film from the words of the director himself, from the artist himself. And it just shows his, how shall I put it, his mind is just operating so quickly and so fast. He makes references to different art forms and different works of literature and different films as well. I think he references The Seventh Seal at one point, which is amazing. But it's also not surprising, because he's obviously a very intelligent artist who is so keen and so observant, and also very knowledgeable about his art and many other art forms. And it's also on display here in this film as well, in terms of the kinds of homages that are made, the kinds of references that are made. Starting, I think, with maybe one of the most glorious homages, which is to the film All About Eve, right? All About My Mother, All About Eve, from the very get-go. It's really quite wonderful. And then, of course, the inclusion of Streetcar Named Desire, and then onwards and onwards. So this interview is just yet another example of Pedro Almodóvar's expression of intelligence. At the same time, he is, of course, talking about this film in the context of the tenderness of relationships and the earnestness and the importance of presenting those relationships in an earnest way. And so if you want more information about that from the mind of Almodóvar himself, this is a great place to go. And then the third writing is called The Last Dream by Pedro Almodóvar Caballero. And this is Pedro Almodóvar, but he is being called here Pedro Almodóvar Caballero. And this is very significant, because this is a writing that is made by Pedro Almodóvar himself. And days after the death of his mother, who died on September 10th, 1999, Almodóvar published this letter in the Spanish newspaper El País. And this is an English translation. And so this is a translation of a letter that he wrote about his mother. And he is calling himself Pedro Almodóvar Caballero in order to honor his mother's name. And this is part of the details that he reveals in this letter, which is a really beautiful, heartfelt letter. And it talks about, one thing it does very well is it talks about, or recounts that story about his mother and reading the letters to her illiterate neighbors, which was also recalled in that documentary that I mentioned about his mother. It's also mentioned in this letter here too. It's really great. There's also talk about how just details about what she was thinking and what she was concerned about, even up to her final moments, and things about what she was dreaming, and there was things about a storm, and those little quirks of personality that just get at the once again, get at the heart of the matter and his love and dedication to the memory of his mother, and how much his mother meant to him, and how much his mother being there meant that he could grow in the way that he ended up growing as a person and as an artist. And this feeling of sadness and warmth, of nostalgia and memory, of a kind of beautiful place that is no longer now, I think gets also at this feeling of loss, but also doing something with the loss, trying to make something worth the loss, if you know what I mean. In other words, this film, All About My Mother, is also a film about loss, and it's also about how characters deal with this notion of loss and grief. And this letter by Almodvar, Pedro Almodvar Caballero, is really a great example. It's almost a perfect distillation of the artist's feeling of loss and grief and how to deal with that. And what a poignant way to connect with this film, All About My Mother, in terms of a thematic viewpoint towards its characters, but also it also shows what the filmmaker was going through contemporaneously together with the release of the film, which makes this film, I think, it makes it so powerful as a work that is not only a film about its characters, but also a reflection of the filmmaker himself. So that is, in essence, what the booklet provides, and so I strongly recommend you take a look at that if you have a chance. And I should also mention very quickly that we have this great cover art here. According to the production credits, here we have art director Sarah Habibi, Eric Skillman, illustrations Petra Eriksson, and so this is a lovely sort of rendition. The use of color is really great, and it's a reproduction of a sort of famous moment early on in the film that I think is relied upon in a lot of the poster art of the film, but this is obviously a sort of artistic representation of that particular moment of the film, and I love it. And it has a nice, how should I put it, artificial look, and I mean that in a very earnest way. And I also mean that because I want to link that to the idea of how this film and Almodóvar are trying to get out the tension and the beautiful tension between fiction and reality. And I think in a very interesting way, I think this cover art gets at that in an artistic rendition that is very appropriate. So this is the Criterion presentation of the film All About My Mother. I am very fond of this film, and I'm very fond of this release. And despite the fact that there aren't any new Criterion supplements, this is still a film that is packed with a lot of information-filled supplements that are undoubtedly very, very helpful, and some even quite moving, to the point that this is still a strongly recommended release from Criterion. Of course, it would have been really nice to see an audio commentary. It would have been nice to see maybe one or more Criterion-produced supplements, maybe an interview with an Almodóvar expert or something like that. But we did see something similar with other films released by the Criterion Collection by Pedro Almodóvar. So it's a little bit curious that we didn't see anything of that nature also included as part of the supplemental selection here with this film. But that is not to say that this is lacking in any substantive supplements. On the contrary, the supplements that are included here are brilliant, and I really want to make that clear. They are really brilliant, so they are worth checking out if you have the time to do so, and I hope you do, because they are really excellent, and they help to buoy and to support this release of a really excellent film that still packs a real emotional punch, even now. So it's a great release, well-timed, and very welcome. This is the film from 1999 by Pedro Almodvar. This is under Spine 1012. This is All About My Mother. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. What do you think about this film? Do you have any thoughts? If so, please feel free to leave your thoughts in the comment section below. As always, I'd love to hear what it is you have to say. So until we meet again, my friends, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. So until we meet again, cheers.